Let's start at the top of the list. So first up's Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram, being arrested in France, and it looks like over not protecting children's security. So basically enabling pedophiles to use Telegram and lots of other nefarious uses of Telegram. And the question I have for you, the question I have for us and the industry is around where does technology or these kinds of platforms, where does the responsibility start and stop with to do with national security or dealing with gangsters or pedophiles online, all these horrific things? And it doesn't seem like there's an easy answer. And I know you think about this stuff. So should he have been arrested? I mean, he's like an Elon free speech absolutist. Obviously, I mean, his position is if you break the rules for one person, you break them for all. And also, I think technically, he's saying that technically they can't break their own encryption, which I guess is quite a nice promise. But what's your take? Where would you go? Should he have been arrested?
I think it's a terrific question. I think there's so many angles on this. The first angle, of course, is sort of free speech, incredibly important. Telegram being used in many countries around the world that are autocratic. Really, he's always argued it's a free speech platform that helps people in those places engage and talk openly in ways they otherwise could not. On the other side of that, you have all the nefarious uses that the app potentially is being used for. Terrorism, smuggling, child sex abuse, which I think, of course, the conspiracy theorists would say, look, the reason that that's the charge has been put forth is it's sort of the one thing that, everybody can say it's just so abhorrent that we can't possibly condone such use. I saw there was speculation that he had been invited to Paris under the pretext of a lunch with the president and said had been lured into a trap. There are folks saying that it's the US government that's behind this. They're out to get him. And then, on top of that, I saw folks saying, look, TikTok was the first. And really, they're just trying to strike off all these free speech platforms one after the other. No, on the other side of that, if we take the TikTok case, we know that TikTok is an instrument of propaganda by the CCP. It's been well documented in multiple research contexts that if you want to talk about things that are too sensitive for the CCP, they just don't figure on TikTok at all. Whereas, all the nonsense and conspiracy theories, the things that are undermining Western policy, they flourish there. And so, we know there were issues with TikTok. I don't know if we know as much about what's behind Telegram and how bad the case is. It seems to me that you have to strike a balance. You can't have these powerful tools.
What is the balance? This is the challenge. What is the balance? If we either have encrypted end-to-end secure communications where the government or other nefarious bodies can listen into you, or we don't. So what's the answer?
Well, there's metadata, potentially, even if you can't see what's being talked about, maybe you can see who is talking, and that may not be encrypted, and maybe that could be instrumental in helping to figure out whether nefarious actors are planning something. I think the issue, as I understand it from the French side, is they basically said, look, we've been trying to reach out to Telegram to have a conversation, and we've been stonewalled. And that is the same issue the EU agencies had. The EU Agency for Criminal Justice Corporation also struggled to get any meaningful dialogue with Telegram. And what do you do then if you have a technology platform that you suspect is being used for all these heinous crimes, and the owners are saying, look, we basically don't want to engage with you, it's your problem? Then what's the next step? I don't know whether he should have been arrested. I don't know the case well enough for details, but it seems to me that, maybe Telegram hasn't done themselves any favors there.
Because there's the Russian angle, because I know that Telegram is being used heavily with Russian forces. I know that obviously when what was his social media? Was it Contact in Russia?
Yeah.
So I know that obviously he left in 2014, became a French resident, as well as I think he's also residing in St. Kitts officially, has a St. Kitts passport. So it just I'm wondering if it's political. I'm wondering, because it's not like the French government didn't know his position. They know full well he's a free speech absolutist and is not going to kowtow to requests to unlock or to dig into. And I know I've seen in interviews he's explicitly said, I cannot see content. I cannot see it's end-to-end encrypted. It's secure. That's the whole point of the platform. So an ongoing debate.
Yeah.
Moving on to bigger and smaller firms. So, as a small VC firm, obviously we look at some of the mega firms who are living on these massive fee structures, and it feels like there's mega firms and everybody else. But you posted this really interesting article. Was it Kit Harrison? What was the chap's name?
Yeah, exactly. It was. And I think in essence, part of the debate is you got Fred Wilson from Union Square Ventures, legendary investor. He's saying, look, we don't need any more $10 billion funds. We need many more $100 million funds that can go out and let 1,000 flowers bloom. And then the other side, others have argued, is that if we want to fund big, difficult things, we need mega funds to help us take big swings at the things that really matter because they require a lot of capital. Now, in Europe, we know we've been struggling to raise mega funds. Recently, Balderton, they announced that they had raised £1.2 billion over 2 new funds. And so there's this rather odd argument going on in VC Twitter and LinkedIn, where some LPs argue that investors should only back large brand name funds because it's they have lower perceived risk, and others argue that they should only back kind of emerging small funds because the returns are better. And if you look at the stats, lower funds and early stage funds, they do offer better average returns, but it's with a bigger variance. Of course, there's more risk. Recently, a PitchBook study looked at more than 30,000 companies. And they said that sort of over 30,000 companies we've looked at over more than a decade, the Series D failure rate was lower than 10%, whereas the seed failure rate was higher than 35%. But on the other hand, the average annual return, when you look at IRR, is much higher for seed, so in excess of 25%, whereas the Series D is below 15%. So there's a huge distribution between the best and the worst funds, but there's also a big upside. So I think in terms of the big versus small, for me, it's much more we probably need all of them, because we need people to fund the very early stage, the risky thing, to let 1,000 flowers bloom, to get things off the ground. But we then also need folks that can go in with more capital later on to let things grow once they need that money. How do you see the debate of big versus small?
I think it depends on. I think you have to give it context, right? I mean, if you look at returns for LPs, I get that they are split between the safety of the tier one big brands, because they create their own gravity, don't they? So if you're dealing with the Andreessens, the Sequoias, the Benchmarks, they have their own. It's a bit like no one gets fired for hiring IBM. They have their own safety and gravity. But as you say, they don't perform as well. But it feels like there's this bifurcation between mega funds and everybody else. And then you've got to pick a stakeholder that's going to benefit from whether they go with the big firms or the small. Startups are always going to benefit from going with a tier one brand just because of the brand cachet. But then
I think it depends on the trajectory of the firm. It's what we've seen some founders say is you go with a big firm, as long as it's up and to the right, which it may be initially, it's great. But if you then go through a rough patch, exactly. There's just not your option number 42, and people stop showing up for board meetings and they don't necessarily help you anymore. And maybe you needed was just that help as you were in the desert, you're finding your way back. And we know some startups take a long time to mature. So actually, don't think it's as clear cut. I think you make a strong argument, but I think there is a need for firms of all sizes and scales. It's not a one or the other.
I mean, the all I would feel more comfortable with, and maybe this is just a proxy, is if there were more mega funds in Europe. It feels like that would create another kind of gravity. So that would maybe open up some of the listings, conversations that would enable more European startups to stay in Europe. So even if we just had that, just for the basic reasons of having more funds of more sizes and then more European gravity, I would have it just on that basis first.
Yeah, completely agree. We need European venture to grow up. We need us to have bigger firms and more capital in the later stages. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I love that we're a small firm and that we're hungry and we're going to really, really help founders. But I also get that you need both sides of the coin. So Keir Starmer has effectively said that the autumn budget is going to be painful. And then there was all this speculation, painful for who and how and when and why, without getting into the politics of it. And the only thing I could think of was, how is this going to affect startups? How is this going to affect the investing landscape? How is this going to really affect SEIS, EIS at the grassroots level, this core early stage startup infrastructure that we have in the UK that's so important? And then I was thinking, it feels like it's going to be wealth tax, capital gains. It feels like it's going to be focused in those kinds of directions. And then I thought, does that mean that wealthier individuals are going to perhaps liquidate assets, get away from CGT? Is that then going to affect how they invest in SEIS, EIS? So that's where my brain was kind of traveling. And I don't know if you had any reflections on that, but is it going to be painful for whom? How?
It's painful. It's a 22 billion pound black hole. And if you look at how many people there are to cover that hole, there's about a sort of 37, 38 million adults and working age in the UK. So, and the mean take home pay is around £2,300 a month. So if you take the 22 billion pounds and you spread that evenly over everybody, that means sort of about £600 more per adult. You know, that's about a full week's take home pay for the median earner. So that's a lot of money. So it just goes to show the scale of the problem. And of course, what's being talked about here is to not let working people pay for this, but concentrating it on, I think, sort of this notion of the broader shoulder. So you're talking about concentrating that plugging that gap on much fewer people. So that means that it'll be a heavier burden to pay. I think the only thing that really makes sense to tax is property, but it's the third rail of UK politics. You can't touch property taxes. That's why they're some of the lowest in the world. So I fear, like you, that it will end up being a tax on business and on investment. And that's a shame, because business and investment, that's what we need more of, not less of. And if you tax things, you tend to get less of it. So if we really want to solve it, I think you have to look at property, even if the property tax is just temporary until it can be blocked more growth. So yeah, I do think there's some pain ahead here, but we know why, right? This problem has been stored up for a long time. We've had years of mismanagement of the economy.
But didn't the Tories say exactly the same thing when they took over? When did they take over? Was it 14? They took over from Labour.
In 2010.
So, and then it was the same thing. And this feels like austerity 2.0. And I don't know where the parallels are, but looking at the Inflation Reduction Act in the States and how they invested their way, and I know there's all kinds of protectionist arguments, there are all kinds of challenges with the IRA, but it felt like they went the opposite direction. And this, to me, smacks of austerity 2.0, and almost the fear-mongering, it's going to be a tough budget in the autumn. It's like, well, surely we should be investing, supporting, and developing, because if we can mirror some of the IRA in some ways, especially in the advent of AI and using technology perhaps as some of the bedrock of this, it feels like we should almost be having the opposite conversation. Yes, it's going to be tough. There might be a little bit of reshuffling of priorities, but we are going to build our way out of this. Is this going to be austerity 2.0?
Yeah, look, possibly. Don't think it's as probably as deep, or we're talking about cuts that are as deep. You know, I agree with you. We should invest. I just don't think the Labour Party thought they had the political support, the political will across the country to be able to win an election on an expansionist budget. So they've essentially hemmed them in, saying they won't borrow for anything. I think this is connected with the other issue we highlighted, which is, where's the growth going to come from? If you're not going to invest, then you have to do other things to drive growth. And the obvious thing is to get closer to our European allies. I mean, we spoke and said jokingly that Stama needs to grow a pair. He's been touring Europe now in a bit to reset relations. He's been visiting Berlin. He's been visiting France. But the requests around a reset so far is for a veterinary deal, an agreement on mutual recognition of professional qualifications, and greater ease for UK artists to tour within the EU. Now, these are all great things.
This is going to.
Well, that's the thing. I think they're nice and important things, but they're not going to move the needle. It's totally unambitious, right? So if we're not going to get growth from investing, let's get growth from trade. And if we're saying, look, we're not going to touch anything around Brexit, anything around our relationship with the EU, well, what are we left with? And that, I think, is the challenge. Stama's got a majority of nearly 160 seats. He's got 5 years until the next election. This is the time to be bold. So I think you must prepare.
Right? Not quite that bold,
huh? Sensible bold.
Yeah.
Not foolhardy.
What's the key here, do you think? What would be the key? I mean, I know we talked about freedom of movement last week, and that's been closed down, and that just felt like a really sensible thing, not as a massive economic shift, but a little bit of that opening up of the relations with the European Union. But where do you think? I mean, trade is a massive topic. Is there any subset in there that we think we could not be political, but get through on a very sensible economic basis?
Well, here's the interesting thing. So the union has basically said, look, we will offer for our best and brightest young people to come and work in the UK, and young Brits can go and work in the EU. And that's terrific because we need that talent, right? So this is something that could boost growth for us immediately. And the EU is open to it and has sort of said, look, this is something that would go a long way towards starting to repairing relations. And I'm hoping that some of what we're seeing now from the Labour government is just political posturing as opposed to actually a red line in policy. Yeah. I think if you could get that youth mobility scheme up and running, if that could be used to maybe also get some concessions on other trade aspects, well, then you're starting to be in business. So that's the way I hope they're going to go.
Well, maybe this is just the beginning. Maybe the veterinary deals is just the beginning. Let's hope so. But there's a whole world of movement happening in cancer vaccines, a topic close to our hearts. Where were you going with this?
Well, so recently there was a big feature in the FT about the cost of solving cancer. Some cancers like pancreatic cancer, they have such low survival rates that they're basically no pressure groups calling for funding because all the victims, they die. It's sad and a little bit macabre. But if you take a step back, COVID was a terrible shock to the world, and the rapid development and deployment of the mRNA vaccines were criticized due to the unforeseen side effects. Now, as you know, I felt some of those myself. I know how tough it was, but there were also some good things coming out of it. The mRNA is an incredibly powerful technology, and coupled with AI, it's really helping us radically lower the cost of drug development. And so you can accelerate the time it takes to develop new drugs. You can make more personalized drugs. And so we now have more than 100 cancer vaccines in various stages of development. And last week, the world's first lung cancer treatment or vaccine trials launched across 7 countries. So cancer is not one thing, it's many things, but it's highly likely that we can make a significant leap in cancer treatment in our lifetime. So amid all the dire news, I think it's just worth remembering what a special time we live in. Both of us lost our fathers to brain tumors. It's very personal to us. What's your prediction for the development of the medical technology over the coming years?
Well, the lens I'm kind of always look at this stuff with is what can we do? What can the startups that we invest in, how can they be part of this? And I think AI will enable some of the smaller players to play their part in a lot of the tooling that goes in. But obviously, these are mega companies. I mean, there's not so much government money goes into this stuff, although a bunch, but it's mainly massive private businesses that are dealing with these very high risk, high reward kinds of treatments. But I'm always thinking, where is the investment angle? Where is the European angle? Where is the startup angle? And my sense is that AI will be the unlock in some of these things, yet to be seen as to how and where. But I'd like to see some of the startups. I mean, we don't do that much in health and bio because it's slightly sideways to our thesis. But I'd like to think that some of the companies that we work with, that we touch, that we're involved with, can be part of the whole machinery. I'm not quite sure how much of this stuff is going on in Europe and how much of this stuff is going on in the States or other places. Do you know?
Yeah. So Denmark is a leader in medicine and biotechnology. So I'm trying to stay a little bit close to it. There were issues around another disease that's been breaking out, if you've seen, in Africa, and a Danish company, Bavarian Nordic, were quick with a vaccine. So a lot is happening in Europe, and actually I think more is happening in younger companies and startups than is sometimes appreciated. I'm an angel investor in a small way, a California-based company called Siren Biotechnology that specifically works on solving brain cancers using gene therapy treatments. So I think there's so much happening. Amid all the dire news, and it's easy to be doom and gloom, there's a lot of good stuff going on.
Yeah, no, this bang on. I think Doom obviously wins in the news, and it's not. And this is these kinds of hyper-personalized medicines, because the next step after the mRNA stuff is going to be the personalized version where your body is treated for you by you. And I feel it hopefully within our lifetimes that'll come. But staying on the AI tip, the next thing we want to talk about was, I was reading an article recently in Bloomberg about how a lot of the big providers of AI are not going to release the same versions in Europe. Now, we've seen these kinds of threats before. I mean, we've seen Meta block services in Australia over certain issues, but this, especially with the advent of Apple Intelligence and the next launch next month of the new iPhone being very Apple Intelligence focused, I'm wondering, what are we not going to see in Europe because of the EU directives and the EU regulation and challenges that AI has in Europe? But also, is this something that is not going to affect the UK, because obviously the UK is no longer part of the EU? So what are we going to get that the EU is not, that the Americans are going to have? And when I was reading, I see it, what will this mean for us? How will this play out? I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
Hey, look, I think you can't regulate your way to greatness.
Yeah.
It's extremely important that regulators, they provide a level playing field, that they help to stimulate investment and growth, and importantly, that they make sure that negative externalities are costed and paid for. So, for example, if we pollute, in our business or daily lives, we have to pay for the cost of cleaning that up. Otherwise, there's too much incentive to pollute. So a lot of things are really, really important from a regulatory perspective. But I think when that is said, regulators then also need to get out of the way and let business do what business is good at. And I fear that with some of the AI regulation, the EU has gone too far. It may be in part because the UK was not around the table and was not part of helping to shape the legislation when it was done.
Yeah,
The
but
UK was
we're
always
very risk averse, aren't we? When we are the UK, we had the domestic part crowd, and we went straight into the fear, the dooming, the regulation, the control, rather than, or at least having a balance. It felt like where there was, I think when Jeremy Hunt was around, he was talking about, investing and building and doing, and it felt like at least there was some noises from government to maybe balance out this fear, risk, control, regulation against an invest, do, build, but I wonder where the UK is going to go, whether we're going to align on the EU side because it feels like we have the choice, or whether we're going to be a little bit more open, a bit more risky.
Yeah, I think it's going to be somewhere in between the two to some extent. If we want to sell to the EU markets or the EU customers, it's our biggest market, then we have to align with their regulation, which we can't help shape. So I think UK businesses to some extent are under that regulation, whether we want to or not, if we want to access that asset market. But I do think there is some leeway, especially in the early days, with taking more of a US aligned approach.
I hope we do. I hope there is a real push for building, because we have the talent and they're here, they're in the unis and around it. It's like, let's give that some freedom. Moving to Germany. So it feels like that it's a tale of two countries. Germany, stagnation, unserious, and then there's this Germany that it feels like on one hand there's this kind of regulatory oversight which is very, very stifling, and on the other it feels like they've almost had an unlock with regards to energy and renewable. So this was your topic. What's happening here?
Yeah, look, I say this with all love and respect. Like Germany used to be, and the Germans used to be the best at everything, right? The best at making cars, the best at playing football, just the strongest economy, and it is still. Well, yeah, and so many things. And it is still the largest economy in Europe, and they have the most sophisticated manufacturing sector. The challenge is, Europe basically doesn't really work if Germany doesn't work. And Germany has not been working for a while. The growth has been flat. If you look at the period over the last 5 years, the economy basically has not been growing since 2019, only 0.5% over that period. So Germany is a manufacturing hub. Energy is key to manufacturing. First, COVID gave that a knock, and then the challenges with China exports gave that a knock, and then Ukraine conflict meant a stop for cheap Russian gas and soaring energy prices. So not all is doom and gloom. As you say, they've been developing record renewables. They've streamlined the permitting system. They make it easier to build wind and solar.
They can strip out the nonsense regulate. They can create regulatory change when they want to, right? They're a very industrial bunch. So
absolutely. But at the same time, they are crushing their nuclear energy industry. They've literally started destroying perfectly working nuclear power plants.
Why?
I think that's a disaster.
Politics? Is this just
it's pure politics? It's pure politics. I mean, you can't transition away from hydrocarbons solely with renewables. You need to meet the base load. And nuclear energy is the best option we have for doing that. It just seems profoundly unserious to decommission this great source of no CO2 energy. And then on top of that, we know, all the challenges that German startups have had, right? About complicated tax rules
Yeah.
and complicated legal rules, and lots of frustrated entrepreneurs. So it just begs the question: has Germany become an unserious country?
Or maybe it was always. Maybe it's always both. It's always the joke is, the Germans don't have a sense of humor, but when you go there, you go, they have their own version of a sense of humor. It's like they have this serious regulatory notary framework, but they know how to break the rules when they need to. So hopefully they'll get back on track and get out of the politics.
I do hope they find a way. We need them in Europe. They are the locomotive, and we need them to take that role seriously again.
I think money will talk. That would be my assumption. And my sense is with the nuclear stuff, it was just inertia, right? There was obviously some kind of ruling pre-Russia-Ukraine that said we're going to start decommissioning, and maybe they just didn't get their act together. Oh, well, hang on a second, energy crisis looming. Maybe we won't. It just felt like it was like we've signed this off and we're just going to do the thing. Oh, shit bags. No, but at least they've got the renewables on the flip side. Doesn't they're doing a lot? Sorry, is there anything else on that before we move on?
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about agentic workflows. I've been watching Andrew Ng from the AI Fund, and I want to pitch your notion and get your ideas. So, my sense is that 2025 for the enterprise and for business is going to be built with agentic workflows. So, larger organizations are going to take these AI toolkits and have AI talking to AI, these AI agents within their organizations talking to each other to do functions. And the idea of an agentic workflow, if you haven't come across it, is that you have these effectively LLMs beyond chatbots, with these LLMs doing things like a coder might say, build a website. Then you might have another agent that says, check the code of the website. So you have these workflows built by these AI agents or these AI bots. And it feels like a very practical application of AI at the business level. So beyond foundations, beyond tooling, where businesses can use these incredibly smart toolkits to build workflows and automate a lot of what they do. And it feels like, so my pitch to you, Mads, is that 2025 we're going to start seeing the rollout and the application meaningfully in business around agentic workflow. Yes or no?
I think that's a super exciting vision. If you think about how we've been making software over the last 15 years, we've basically gradually started to migrate from very monolithic structures where you created software that was just one giant blob of code to microservices architectures, where you, instead of having this giant blob of code, you have lots of little pieces of code, each responsible for one little thing. They can be a little bit harder to manage, but they're much easier to maintain. They're faster to develop. And it's effectively like thinking that you have all these hundreds or even thousands of little APIs that are all calling each other, doing different things. Now, up until now, these were all completely deterministic. There was a piece of code, there was a program written by a human developer that said exactly what the code needed to do at all times. And what's so exciting now is with these autonomous agents we've started to see, you can maybe start swapping some of these microservices out for things that are actually autonomous and do things on their own. So incredibly exciting vision. And I think you're absolutely right. We're going to see a ton of innovation there. And this is precisely the reason why we expect so much productivity enhancement in corporates over the coming decade.
Yeah, I think we're onto it. Well, that was the end of my docket. Anything else on your mind?
The sun is shining. It's a lovely Friday. Summer's over. The sun's still out though.
I was out this morning on the little patio bit. And I thought, do you know what I'll do? I'll start reading about what we're going to talk about and just reabsorb. And I sat there with my coffee, and it was so cold. I was thinking, this isn't any kind of fun. I'm freezing my norks off. But yeah, the sun that's it. Summer is done. Into the autumn, my wife's favorite time of year. Well, that's
back
it.
To work, baby.
Back to work.
Okay.
Yeah. Back to work. Lovely chatting with you.
We'll catch
up next week.